Welcome to the Digital Enterprise Society podcast, addressing all aspects of the digital enterprise, inspiring connection without boundaries and creation without limits. Thank you for tuning in. Here are your hosts, Thom Singer and Craig Brown.
Hey there, and welcome back to the Digital Enterprise Society podcast. Thank you so much for coming along on the journey of this show. You know, we've been doing this show for 2.5 years, and it was designed, and we think we deliver on this, it was designed to be a resource for those who work in and around PLM. The Digital Enterprise Society is a forum for the exchange of ideas surrounding the tools, processes, and practices used across the product lifecycle. To learn more, visit digitalenterprisesociety.org. My name is Thom Singer, and I am so fortunate I get to host this show every single week. And usually I'm joined by my co-host, Craig Brown, but every month or so, I do a personal career development show where I interview an expert who is going to bring you ideas that are just going to help you just up your game just a little bit when it comes to how you do your day-to-day job from the standpoint of personal development. And today I am really, really excited because we are joined by Joe Ferraro. Now, Joe Ferraro does a lot of things. He has actually spent the last 23 years as a public school teacher. God, I mean, who do we respect more than teachers, right? Especially in the last 2 years. He teaches English, public speaking, and creative writing to high school students. Sometimes I think I have a bad day, and I just have to think it can't be as bad as someone who has to teach high school students. He also is a podcast host. He hosts a show called 1% Better. And we're going to talk a little bit about how you can be a little bit better when it comes to the questions you ask and the conversations you have. He recently released an online course called Damn Good Questions. And then he has his own consulting company that you can find at damngoodconversations.com. Hey, Joe, welcome to the Digital Enterprise Society podcast.
Thom Singer, the intro was pitch perfect. I know people tell you have a good radio voice, but you and I know that's table stakes, man. You're bringing the insight, and I'm so excited to be here.
I love hosting this show. I've been doing it for 2.5 years, and the Digital Enterprise Society and the people who listen to this show, they're awesome. And today we're going to talk to them about how in their careers, in their jobs, in the departments they work in, how can they ask better questions? So I guess the first question for you is, what makes a good question? What is a good question?
It's clear. It has a crackle. If it can't be clever, it has to be clear, Thom. I think at the beginning, to really look at a good question, we don't want people confused, right? When we think of the biggest error in communication, it's not to be understood. It's to make sure we can't be misunderstood. And I wish I had the attribution of that quote. It's probably George Bernard Shaw. It's always George Bernard Shaw. And I think that when we think about that, a good question is clear. But then I think we have to get into that advanced level for listeners of the show, which is once it's clear, if it can be a little stylistic or clever, that's great. And how do we do that? There's a lot of ways, but one way is a macro way to think about leaning a little bit towards novelty, not to be those tchotchke novelty where you look at the license plates and they have the name and it's like Kish, but more on the level of what's something that they probably haven't been asked before. What's something that you could have gotten if you listened to someone else's podcast? When I interview people, I'm listening and thankful to other podcast hosts because then I can get a level deeper. So I want it to be clear. I want it to be a little bit novel. I want it to show some research, and I want it to be able to pull from my curiosity so that it helps people.
So when people work as part of a department in the tech side of a manufacturing company, how can they ask better questions? I mean, where do they even start? I mean, clarity makes sense, but there's got to be more to it than that.
Yeah, I think there is. And I think you got to be honest, right? So self-assessment in anything in life is great. The reason people don't write down what they spend every month is because you don't want to see it, right? The reason I don't write down everything I eat in a month is because I don't want to come face to face with it. But I think there's super value there and there's a lot of growth. So when I think about being face to face with ourselves and saying, how often do I ask questions in my personal life, in my work life? Am I the guy or gal that's unafraid to ask a question at the meeting, or am I always trying to get out of the meeting, right? That moment where you're like, oh, don't ask a question. Don't ask a question. We're almost done. That's not me, right? I'm not extending the meeting for the meeting's sake, but I'm unafraid. So step one, hey, do we ask a lot of questions in our life? Step two, what's the beginning of each question? Let's go really granular. If you start a lot of questions with do, they're probably going to be closed-ended questions, right? Are, A-R-E, close-ended. We replace that with what, and all of a sudden it opens it up. And that may be basic for some of the listeners, but I think it's crucial to kind of ground that in fundamentals. If you're going to ask how questions and why questions and what questions, you're going to start to see the world open up to you. And then you can go from there. So those are some basic things that help. Are we asking a lot of questions? Are we unafraid to ask questions? Are they open-ended? And then you kind of work from there.
So some people might be thinking, that's great, Joe. However, my boss isn't the type of guy who wants me asking a lot of questions. So, what do they do if they're in a situation where they're not sure that it's appropriate in their department based on what's going on with the task at hand to be asking questions?
Wow, a little piece of my heart just broke there. I'm trying to imagine a scenario where the leader of the team would be discouraging questions. But the reality is it happens. Not only do they do it explicitly, but it could be implicitly. It could be this unspoken a bias, right? That's like discouraging that. And that's not a great place to work from that standpoint. But I think knowing the quote unquote enemy is a big place to start, right? So now you're not going to be the guy or gal that's raising your hand at the meeting and it's going to be culturally inappropriate. But I think on those one-on-one moments, I think it's the time. I think in the inter meetings with the teams, I think that's the moment where you just really start. And honestly, a great place to start is in the personal life. You will connect some worlds. We'll connect people who are working all day to teaching, to having parenthood experiences. When I go home and we have dinner with my two kids, how was school today? Seems like, oh, Joe, well, it's an open-ended question. But unfortunately, we know how that one ends, and it's fine. Nothing happened. What'd you learn? We just try to go in a little slightly different direction in our house, and we'll say things like, what was the highlight of your day? And that question has opened up discussions like you wouldn't believe. And you can go the other direction. You could say, what was one thing you wish you could do over today? And we're not asking the crazy stuff. If you could be a kitchen appliance, what would you be and why? That's not what I mean by novelty. I just mean looking at, and maybe this is a good thing for people, a little bit of backwards design. What are we trying to accomplish with this question? We're not trying to look smart. We're trying to open up our child's imagination to feel safe and sharing. And I think in the workplace, there's huge applications. Kind of looking down the road 2 clicks. What am I hoping to get from Sheila with this question? What do I want to learn more about on this project? Like, in other words, to finish this thought, if you have a project due and you want to know how we're doing on the project, sometimes the appropriate answer is, Sheila, how are we doing on the project? But sometimes it's a much different tact. And I think that just on that level, every time we ask a question, thinking about, and better yet, every time you hear a question, think about how it could have been just a little bit more clear.
So I've always thought that asking a lot of questions was a smart thing to do, but some people don't ask a lot of questions. They just sort of go based on what they hear and stuff like that. So in the workplace, how can someone train themselves to ask more questions?
I think we go to the old grandmother proverb, we have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. And I think we start to say, hey, and going back to the classroom or the workplace, there's different forms of participation. In the old days, class participation was down meant Johnny didn't raise his hand. We're smarter than that. We're more sensitive than that. We're more trained than that now. And that goes for the workplace as well, which is now you can be actively listening without raising your hand. You can hand in a 1-page reflection on your unit instead of raising your hand and being part of a debate. So I think the same thing applies in the workplace. Start listening to your colleagues, and you're not going from a judgmental place. As the Ted Lasso made us know from Walt Whitman, be curious, not judgmental. Start to identify. In fact, think right now, for people listening, you could probably name someone in your company who you think asks the best questions. Now, you may never have thought about it prior to Tom and I's discussion, but a name will inevitably bubble up. You might have he or she asks the annoying questions. Go 1 pace down the road and get to a place where you say, who is it that typically asks the question that everyone else is thinking? I think that's a great place to start. And then you get a little notebook and you start jotting down cool question formation. You start thinking about, if you're a podcast listener, I'll jump right to one of my most advanced tactics because I know your audience can handle it. Pausing podcasts is one of the greatest service you can do. You pause a podcast after a guest answers a question and you imagine what the next question would be. You can make all your proverbial money in the follow-up questions, right? Because if someone says X, the guest answers Y, here's the moment where you get to choose, almost like a decision tree, what's the very next thing you'll ask. I love that moment.
Wow. I don't know that I do that. I don't know that when I listen to a lot of podcasts and I host several podcasts, but I don't know that I actually, when I'm listening to one, that I actually ever pause it, and even just to reflect what was just said, because so often we go from one thing to another that we don't take time on the podcast to let people breathe. At a meeting, when I'm speaking at a conference and I do some MC work and I do some keynote speaking, in that case, it's really easy because I can tell people, now turn to your table and talk about what we just did and what is the most important thing. But we're listening to a podcast, we don't have that same ability to have that exercise. So that's actually really interesting. You brought something else up a second ago, and that was have a notebook. So when you're working on an ongoing project inside a company, what a great idea to have a notebook for questions so that when you get to the meeting, you can remember what you thought of the Tuesday before so that you don't do it. Because we all get into meetings and then we get out of the meeting, we get back to our desk and we go, darn it, I never asked about that one thing. So, is this notebook thing a good idea for everybody, like just in the job? Or maybe it's just the note section of their phone, just having a place where they keep questions so they can refer back.
Yeah, when I show my coaching clients or my students just a thumb scroll through my iPhone notes app, without the search feature, I'd be lost. So I absolutely recommend that. And just title your notes, right? Great questions, or, for branding purposes, I might say damn good questions, Tom. But the point is, it remains the same. And one last thing on your point, there's a poet named David White with a W-Y it's spelled. He said once he reads every line of poetry when he's at his readings twice. I thought it was very strange when I heard it, but then he had another phrase that has never left my ears. He says a poem line can be violent to the ears. And I had never thought of that. And his explanation was, by the time your brain is processing this beautiful phrase, you're onto a new phrase. So David White does this very unconventional thing and reads it twice. I think we can simulate that in the pausing of podcasts.
I love that. I love that. So what are some techniques that people aren't taking advantage of when it comes to asking better questions, or, as you say, damn good questions?
There's two that come to mind right away that I think people probably haven't heard and I think can implement fairly easily. One is something I call a high velocity question. I think there's a great way to explain a high velocity is by looking at the inverse. There's so much power in inversion. A low velocity question, not to take a shot. Again, anytime you talk questions, you start thinking, oh, maybe I've asked that question. I know, oh man, I've fallen victim to that. Oftentimes when we have an author on, we say, why did you write that book? And what I find that to be is not a bad question, but a low velocity question. Because even if there's a great story behind it, it's going to take a while to deliver. We've lost control of the mic. And even if the story is so magnificent, it's a story that author has rehearsed. So we lose novelty. We don't get into any urgency, and it's not super specific. If we just shift that to something like, what's your least favorite chapter in the book? Or what's the chapter that you don't think gets enough love? Or what did your wife say when you came home with the advance for the book? We get into the specificity. We get into the nooks and crannies. And oftentimes I take a lot of pride in my first question. I once had a woman on the show, and instead of asking her all the talking points, I said, I went through your Instagram page and I noticed you have a turkey heart featured on one of your last photos. What's the story of the turkey heart? And all of a sudden, 30 seconds into the conversation, we have rapport and we're ready to rock and roll. So I think high velocity is huge. The other one I think is asking questions like a poker player. The short version of the story, Tom, I played a lot of poker, but I didn't want to do it in a gambling way. So I started reading books, and I read 18 books on poker, and I started getting into it. It was either golf or poker. I decided it was going to be poker. And if I was going to make money, I had to keep records, and I took it very systematically. And one day when I was listening to a podcast, I heard someone say, what is the ideal bet on 4th Street if you're facing blah, 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 technical terms? The 4th card comes out. What's your ideal bet? He was looking for this universal. And the guy who was an online poker player changed my question life forever by saying, I don't have a universal bet. I bet the precise amount. I bet the precise amount that I think will accomplish the job I'm looking to accomplish. And if I think it's $1 that will get him to bet his life savings because I have the best hand, I'll bet $1. And if I think it's $1 million because I want him to fold because I have the worst hand, I'll bet $1 million. And even though it's a game of impartial information, that's how we do it. And it works beautifully translated into questions. If I want the guest to get deep in thought, I'll ask a question a certain way. If I want to change the pace, I'll ask a shorter question. And if we look at that backward design model and we think, what would a poker player do here if he had aces? And what would a host do if he wanted so-and-so to do what? I think it can be super, super powerful for people.
So let's take that into the workplace. So how can you ask questions like a poker player when you're part of a team working on a project?
You ask yourself, what is it that you're hoping for from Zach in this project? So you have a team member named Zach, and Zach is not delivering on X, or Zach is over delivering on Y. And you sit down and you have a quiet moment or two with that notebook and you say, what do I hope Zach will do? And then when you come up with that answer, the worst way you could approach it is to say, well, I want Zach to do this, so I'm going to tell Zach to do this. No, you want to lead with curiosity, and you want to think of the very best way to get what you want. And I don't mean that in a manipulative way. I mean that in a leadership way. I mean, there's more than one way to lead somebody. And sometimes helping them find the answer to themselves is equally powerful. So I'm looking at that piece of paper and I'm saying, all right, I want Zach to work harder at school or at work. How do I get Zach to work harder in this project? I can't say, Zach, what can I do to make you work harder? You start workshopping it. You start thinking, what is it that motivates Zach? Okay. And you say, and you go round and round there, and you get into this little personal laboratory, Tom. And I think at that point, it becomes a super creative act, and you figure out what's the very best thing I could ask to get what I hope to from this project.
So it's interesting because you talk about the power of helping Zach or whoever get to that answer themselves by the questions that you're asking. And as I'm listening to you talk, I'm thinking of your 23 years as a public school teacher. And I'm imagining that you're a very good public school teacher and probably one of the ones that wins the awards when the students vote on who, because I'm assuming this is what you do with your students. So how did you get to the part where you became an expert on asking questions? Was it through years of teaching? How did this become your expertise?
I think I'm lucky to have spirals in my life, right? I was always a curious soul, says my dad. So when I would watch a baseball game with him and a guy was stealing second and the tag was placed and the ball went flying into the outfield and he tagged him and he would have been out, but the ball went flying into the outfield. Instead of just watching that like a normal kid, I asked my dad, what would have happened if the second baseman came over and grabbed that ball before it hit the ground, much like an NFL throw? It never made the contact with the ground. Maybe he should still be out. And I think eventually my dad was like, please go play. Stop asking these questions. So I had that starting point, right? Curiosity, inborn, but then it can be developed. That's a conversation for another day, but definitely can be. So then you start there. Then you get into, well, I'm going to have communication as my forefront. I studied communication in college. When I went to teach English, it wasn't Shakespeare and Beowulf and even Frost that drew my love. It was the ability to help young people communicate just a little bit better than maybe someone at a different school. And my last unit for the English class was called listening, right? Listening unit. Well, I'm bringing them the very best of podcasting and TED Talks and Celeste Headley, and I'm listening to Julian Treasure, and I'm exposing them all those. And the title of the unit officially became Listening, Why It's Important and How to Do It Better Than Any High School Student in North America. So when I put that in front of them, I'm almost writing copy. But then I might be lucky enough to interview James Clear that week. And all of a sudden I'm saying, do you know this thing from Atomic Habits? And I'm trying to do it all without saying anything about my podcast. It's not about me. It's about them. But I'm trying to put in front of them the resources that will separate them. I really believe in this idea of separation. If our students are getting exposed to the very best content and an enthusiastic teacher and they have some support at home, it's becoming very, very hard to fail. So those spirals kind of intersect and they just keep me just like teaching like my hair's on fire.
So it's interesting. You call it spirals. I call it a pattern of circles. And I've had the same thing in my life where things go round and round. And throughout my life, people come back into my life and ideas come back into my life and career aspects come back into my life. And it's just a pattern of circles that keep overlapping. So you use, basically it's the same term, but I actually like spirals. So that's really good. So how can we develop this curiosity in the workplace like you do in the classroom with high school students?
Well, the curiosity in the workplace can start wherever you are. So if you're burnt out, you can reignite it, not from 0 to 60, right? If I'm listening to this podcast and I'm like, I'm burnt out, I don't like my boss, I don't like my team, we don't go in tomorrow and say, we're going to change our entire life. And, I'm not trying to plug the podcast called 1% Better, but I am trying to plug the idea called 1% Better because I've done the crash diets, right? And you lose 30 pounds and you gain 45 back. So what I like to do is start where we are. right? My curiosity has been tamped out like one of those candle wicks that just goes over it, boom, and I don't know what to do. And this guy Joe's all fired up, and just take a deep breath, start where you are, identify one place that you want to improve. And if it's curiosity, you're going to get what's called a keystone habit. You're going to get, just like they tell me abdominals are great to have as a keystone habit for overall fitness. I haven't got there yet, but there's places.
I don't have abs anymore either.
Yeah, no, it's cardio. It's a keystone habit because it helps your mental health. It helps, et cetera. Same thing in the workplace. Let's find one place where we could be a little bit more curious, where we can ask. And I think, the relationship between curiosity and questions, it's not as black and white as people think, right? It's not like curiosity leads to questions, the end. I think it can work both ways. I think it can zigzag. I think you could become more curious by asking questions. And let's say you're not a great question asker. Ask the most boring question you ever asked in your life and then try to upgrade it. Just try to upgrade it, right? Try to say, do you like podcasting? Becomes, what's your favorite aspect of podcasting? Becomes, if you were starting a podcast tomorrow, what's the one thing you would coach someone to change? Becomes, oh, you're thinking of starting a podcast. If it was a complete home run, what would have to happen for that to make it true? And you just play. There is something about play, Tom. We know we're talking about work, but when you have a moment to play, even if it's in your inner life, even if it's in a notebook, I think there's just a great opportunity for people.
So your consulting company is called Damn Good Conversations. So what's the difference between damn good questions and damn good conversations?
I think the questions are the bread and butter for a damn good conversation. I think a better way to say it might be, if you have rapport with someone for years and years and years, you have a really good chance of having a damn good question. The problem is we don't have that kind of time to develop lifelong rapport with everyone we meet. Instead, we want to have those connections that make us feel deeply connected to someone as quickly as possible without being superficial. And I think people can see how that would help them in the workplace, right? If let's start at the interview. When they say, what questions do you have for us? We know people listening to this show already know you have to have questions. But what happens when your questions are so much better than the previous candidate? Like someone just told me the other day, I was mentoring them and they said, I asked 5 questions that they had never heard. And they say, oh, no one's ever asked that before. When you see a boss or a leader go to their pen and say, I don't know the answer to that, no one's ever asked us, and you're interviewing as a candidate, whoop, you're in a completely different pile.
You're getting the job. That's right.
Yeah, because they're saying this is a guy or gal that's thinking in a way that we haven't even thought about yet. So I think that's a big piece of it. I think there's another piece of it, which is if you want to walk 2 inches taller, ask better questions. Like, it's the quickest way to get taller. You're literally walking through life in this kind of insulated way, because you know that if you don't know the answer to something, you're going to be unafraid to ask. You're going to say, even the best experts in the world often say, I just don't know that much about Bitcoin. If you were going to explain it to my 8-year-old son, what would be the most important thing to understand about it? And then slowly, but actually pretty rapidly after a quick learning curve, you start going from clunky questions to seeing the world differently. And then when you're in the workplace, even if we're talking about that reticent person listening, even if you don't ask the question verbally, you're starting to think it. You're starting to have this curiosity be built inside, and you just don't know. Those pattern circles that you talk about, people listening might be at the same company for 20 years, but that's becoming more and more rare. And I think that this is something that makes you more marketable. I think this is something that can mean real dollars and cents for people.
Awesome. So as we wrap this up, keeping it in the business context, what's one thing about questions and or conversations that you wish everybody knew?
I think that most people say, I want my conversations to feel like we're shooting the breeze. I want them to be casual, and I want my podcast to sound like a shoot the breeze conversation. I'm going to use inversion one more time. I believe I want my regular everyday conversations in the business world to feel more like podcasts, because there's something about these headphones and there's something about this microphone that connects you and me, Tom, not just you and me, like we're long lost friends, but that third party, the triangle, you, me, and the listener. Someone right now is listening to this, and this is a slightly heightened form of a conversation. It's not casual. It's not formal. I like to think of it as a crackle of life through it. I like to think of it just slightly heightened from the everyday mundane. And I think as people go through their business life, if they can approach their conversations at work with a slightly heightened version, I think that there's going to be just an exponential return on that investment.
Awesome. Well, Joe Ferraro, if somebody wanted to find out more about you or they wanted to find out about your course, Damn Good Questions, where would they go?
I came downstairs after having a lightning bolt moment and I bought the domain damngoodconversations.com, right? So I bought damngoodconversations.com. I usually wait 2 to 3 weeks to see if something sticks, but I knew it stuck. So that's my digital home I'm really proud of. People can go there and they'll find information on the course. It would mean a lot to me. The podcast 1% Better is a great place to find out if you like the guy that you're listening to. And, you know, if anyone's on Twitter, I don't know if people love Twitter. I'm at Ferraro on air. It's all kind of in one place, but it's really through conversations like this, Tom, that means so much. I just can't thank you enough, my man.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you joining us here on the Digital Enterprise Society podcast. Hey, and thank you to everybody who tuned in and listened. You know what? Every single week, we try really hard to bring you more thoughts, ideas, and actionable information in ideas that will help you grow your career in and around product lifecycle management. The Digital Enterprise Society is the place for the exchange of ideas around digital manufacturing tools. Go check us out right now at digitalenterprisesociety.org.
You've been listening to the Digital Enterprise Society podcast. Learn more about what you heard here today at digitalenterprisesociety.org. Join us again next week for more connection without boundaries and creation without limits.